between African Americans and Hispanics, or Caucasians and Hispanics, in how frequently these particular characteristics occur.
Do you regularly speak with population geneticists about the methods used in your laboratory? And you've described the one on staff. Are there other individuals?
We have a particular person who's a population geneticist who we speak with on a regular basis, and that would be Dr.
I would object as to the we and ask for clarification as to.
Proceed. There's nothing confusing about this. Proceed.
And that would be Dr. Bruce Weir.
Who is Dr. Bruce Weir?
Dr. Bruce Weir is a professor at North Carolina State University. He is a population geneticist and very highly regarded in this area.
Has he written in this area?
Yes, he has.
A little bit or extensively?
Extensively.
In terms of these consultations with Dr. Weir, has he reviewed material at your laboratory that you utilize to report population frequency data?
Yes, he has.
As a result of that, have you incorporated any suggestions, comments, etc., that he may have about the methods of reporting data in your laboratory?
Objection, hearsay is Dr. Weir.
Overrule.
The basic answer to the question is yes. Most of his input is in some data that's being currently developed. He's also looked at much older data that was developed by our laboratory. But he hasn't, in the older data, he has not made any suggestions that resulted in large change or really any changes in procedure to speak of.
And that was after his having, when you say no changes, that was after his having looked at these procedures in place in your laboratory?
Yes, that's right.
All right. Is there a way you can describe the basic method by which population frequencies are actually calculated?
Yes.
All right. Could you do that? And would it help to use a diagram or chart?
This
Can you object again on foundation?
Overrule.
Would it assist you to use a drawing pad, or would you prefer to do it just by a description?
I think we better have the drawing pad.
Okay.
It might save time.
Conclusion of the day.
I believe this would be exhibit 255, People's Exhibit.
255. Mr. Clarke.
Thank you. Dr. Cotton, if you would, and this will be People's Exhibit 255, do you have a title that would describe this particular chart? Population frequencies? Is that
Population data.
population data? All right. Now, if you could use that diagram to demonstrate the basic method by which population frequencies are determined to describe how common or how rare a particular genetic marker type is.
I would object insofar as it's a general statement, but not in the laboratory.
It's a standard principle.
With regard to your laboratory and how you calculate an estimate of how common or rare a characteristic is, how do you do that?
You are going to do that based on a population sample that's either been developed in your laboratory or somewhere else. In our case, our population samples for RFLP were developed in our laboratory. So if you go back to the explanation yesterday, what you're doing is you're taking a sample of people and you're doing the RFLP test on all of those people. So what I'm going to do on the diagram is sort of give you an example of what a sample of people looks like, and then show you how that would be used to estimate a frequency. So we're going to make a mini population
All
on
right.
the diagram.
Now, let me stop you if I can, Dr. Cotton. You've written on this chart labeled population data what appears to be the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Yes,
And then below each of those numbers, you've written in what appear to be 2 bands. Is that what those are intended to depict?
right. In other words, I'm trying to show you a diagram of an autorad with 5 samples on it.
All right, go ahead.
Okay, in my 5 samples, because I have 2 bands for each sample, that is, for each of these people, one from mother, one from father, I've got 10 bands altogether.
Actually, would it help to draw basically lines between these lanes so that, at least on this diagram, it'd be easier to tell them? And maybe in a different color also. Even starting as high as the numbers themselves that label the samples. Okay, now if you would proceed.
Now, let's suppose that we have yet one more sample. We'll call it A. Because I should make either A. And let's say, do I have one more color, maybe black or something?
I hesitate to dry the dry erase. Now I'm concerned it might be erasable.
Mr. Jarvis, we have a black marker. I think I have one back by my microwave. That's just a highlighter, doctor. That'll fade.
We have black, thank you.
We'll go back to my very simple example, and let's remember that where a band is, looking from the top to the bottom, is related to how big it is. And so let's say that we've determined that this band is, in sample A, is 5,000 base pairs. And so the question then is, well, how often would we see another person with this particular band? And although every time you do this, you're not going to go look at a whole set of X-ray films, you have all the data in a computer from those X-ray films, and the question you're saying is, I have a band at 5,000 here. In my population sample, how many other people do I see that have a band there? So let's say that this band was also 5,000, and this band was also 5,000, and this one was also 5,000.
Now, when you use the term 5,000, what are you referring to?
I'm saying the length of DNA that formed this band was 5,000 base pairs long, and using base pairs as a measure of length.
All right, go ahead.
And I've made this example very simple because I've made each of these bands be exactly the same size as this one, and that's not really necessarily, they wouldn't be necessarily that close. So out of the 10 bands that I see, 3 in my sample are 5,000 base pairs. So 3 out of 10 people, 3 out of 10 chromosomes would have a band at 5,000. So 0.3 would be the frequency for this band based on my limited sample.
What would you do then next?
Then you would go through the same exercise for the second this was, I didn't give this any counterparts, that's not so good. I'll tell you what, let's get rid of this one. And make it be here. Suppose this size was determined to be 2,000, and this size was also 2,000. And in this case, for this band, we had 1 out of 10 chromosomes that had this size, so the frequency for this band would be 0.1. The frequency for this combination then would be 2 times the product, 0.3 times 0.1.
Now, you've talked about multiplying things together there, is that right?
Yes.
Why do you use multiplication?
Objection, Your Honor, no foundation for this witness.
Sustain. Rephrase the question.
All right. With regard to the step you just did in terms of multiplying, what's the reason for that? Why do you multiply?
Objection, no foundation for this witness.
Sustain.
As far as, and let's talk about the databases that you have in the laboratory, you've drawn a diagram with basically 5 different persons' DNA
Yes.
on this particular chart.
On this chart.
How large are the actual databases that you use in your laboratory?
The databases in the laboratory range in size from about 150 to somewhat over 300. And the reason I'm saying range is that for one genetic locus, we may have, and for one racial group, this number of people that we've sampled may be different than for another genetic locus or another racial group. So that's the range of sizes of the samples that have been done in our laboratory.
Is that enough of a number of samples to look at to be able to estimate how rare something is?
Objection, no foundations for this witness.
Sustain.
With regard to this examination of databases, and you've used the example of what, results of an RFLP test here,
Yes.
how are these databases created in terms of how do you determine out of these 150 or more samples the various sizes of the various bands?
It's done in exactly the same way the casework analysis is done. You extract the DNA, you cut it with an enzyme, you run it on a gel, you do a southern blot, you get an autoradiograph, and you estimate the sizes of the bands and the autoradiograph with a computer imaging system exactly as you do a regular case.
Is this the same, this process you've described up till now, the same or different from those methods used in serological cases, like methods that type PGM for years previous?
Objection, no. Again, foundation is to serology.
Are you asking me if the calculation is similar?
This principle of looking at databases and determining relative rarity or how common characteristics are.
That would be similar to how those calculations are done for serological markers.
As to serological markers, once you've determined, let's say, an approximation of how common or rare a PGM type is, are there, using serological techniques, similar estimations made of the same sample at another genetic marker like ESD or GLO?
Objection, no foundation for this witness.
Sustain.
To your knowledge, how similar is the method of calculating frequencies in DNA typing to previous methods that have been in use for longer periods of time?
Objection, referring methods, no foundation for this witness.
Sustain.
All right. With respect to these fragments that you've described, and let's go back to the chart you've created, and you show 5,000 for, what is it, 4 of the particular markers and then 2,000 for 2 of them?
Yes.
What role do the other fragments play that you have not at this point labeled an approximate size to, as far as determining from databases how common or rare something is?
How many bands you have is how many alleles you've looked at.
Okay.
So if you want to calculate how often you see something, it's going to be some percent of the total. So we have 10 total, 3 is some 30% of that.
Okay. And as far as your own training, in terms of reading the literature and performing these calculations in your laboratory, is what you've presented simply a simplified version of what you have reported in cases for a number of years?
Yes.
What happens when you look at additional markers as well? In fact, let me back up, let me rephrase that. The diagram that you've just created relates to one genetic location.
Yes.
Do you look at more than one genetic location normally when using the RFLP technique?
Normally, you would look at anywhere between 3 and 5. Now, you could look at more. Our laboratory, I should say, let me restate that. Our laboratory has the capability of looking at 5.
And do you in casework frequently use 5 particular locations?
Yes.
These locations are what? A different, well, what's the technical term for the term location? Do you have a word that you actually use in DNA typing?
Yes, it's the chromosomal locus. So the word that you'll hear is locus. When you say, I have a DNA probe or a genetic location, what you're really saying is the locus, which means the address on the chromosomes for this piece of DNA.
Is there a plural form for locus when you refer to multiple locations?
Loci.
And those are just scientific terms for where something is on the DNA molecule?
That's right.
Okay. May I have it just a moment, Your Honor?
Certainly.
Now, Dr. Cotton, referring to this diagram again and using the example of this one genetic marker location, in your training, and let's go back to the education you received in terms of your formal education, did any of these concepts of population genetics arise?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, to tell you the truth, it's been so long since I was in undergraduate school, I really couldn't tell you what course that they were in. Most of the principles that are used in DNA typing that relate to population genetics, you can find a pretty good discussion for in any college genetics textbook. Now, that doesn't mean the area is simple. There are complicating things that when an analyst such as Bruce Weir looks at a set of data, he's doing something more complicated than what's in a college genetic textbook. But the principles that are involved in doing these calculations are generally outlined at that level. That's where I would have been first exposed to them.
Okay, and then where next in chronological order would you have then been exposed to these same concepts?
When I went to Cellmark.
And could you describe in a little more detail how you came about to be able to calculate these frequencies?
Objection, Mr. Fenner's question.
Overruled.
Basically, it was clear that we needed to be able to make an estimate of, for a particular DNA type or a DNA profile. It was clear that part of the information we needed to provide was how common or rare that profile would be. With assistance from the Cellmark lab in the UK and discussions with the staff at Cellmark, the group of us that were there at the time set up the procedures that we would use, gathered the population samples, did the analysis on the samples. About the time we were doing the analysis on the population samples, Dr. Foreman came to the lab. So it was really a combined effort, certainly not mine alone, to set up the procedures that we are now using for creating estimates for population frequencies. Now, let me make something clear. The calculations are laid out. They make some assumptions. In fact, the particular assumption that the calculation makes is that what's inherited at one genetic location does not affect what's inherited at another genetic location. These sets of assumptions it's not a formula that we devised. The formula that's used in these calculations was developed in the 1930s and is the same type of formula that's used in calculations for serological markers. What we did in the laboratory was develop the population data and then the methods to sort of query that data. And really what I'm getting at is that when I have a band that's 5,000 base pairs, there can be some variation in that size if you run the same sample over and over again. So when we query the data, when we go to the database, we're never looking for something that's exactly this size. We're looking for a range of sizes, and the methodologies that we use to determine those ranges were all developed at Cellmark by the group of us who were working on that project at the time.
Now, you've described in sizing these samples just now the fact that it's an estimation. Is that right?
That's right.
As part of an estimation, then, when you look through databases to see if a sample matches or not, well, let me rephrase that. When you look through a database to determine approximately how rare or how common a particular characteristic is, do you take any steps to make sure that you don't overstate the rarity of that characteristic?
Yes.
How do you do that?
The situation is that when you run a DNA sample on an agarose gel, as I described yesterday, that procedure has limitations. You're getting an autorad, you're using a computer imaging system, and you're estimating the size of the DNA that created a particular band. Even if I take the same sample and I run it 20 times or 50 times, the size estimates will not be identical. Let's go down and write underneath a little more realistic example.
All right. And you're writing on the same diagram, People's Exhibit 255?
Yes, I am. Let's say, and I'll put my new, more realistic example in parentheses. Let's say that this size came out to be 5,010 base pairs. And the next one came out to be 5,030. And the one over here came out to be 4,982. None of these numbers are exactly 5,000. So in my little mini database here, if I ask the question, now assuming that the figures are the ones in parentheses, if I said, how often do I see a person with a band at 5,000, I would look across here at these numbers and I will say, well, I hadn't seen one. So in my 10 people, I hadn't seen anyone, and then you'd have to make some assumption about, well, if you looked at more people, would you see one, or, you know, you'd have to make some calculation after that. So basically, I would very much underestimate this frequency if I look only for this exact size. But we know that there is imprecision in this gel system. It exists in every gel system that's like this, that's run for RFLP typing. It's a feature of the system, and it's important that if you're using this system, you understand that.
Is that, I'm sorry, Dr. Cotton, is that a feature when you say it's a limitation? Is that something unique to your laboratory?
No, what I'm trying to say is that any laboratory that's doing RFLP typing and running an agarose gel will have this same problem.
When you say agarose gel, that's simply what the gel is made of, agarose?
That's right.
Okay, go ahead.
And when I say problem, it's not an insurmountable problem, but it's something you want to be aware of. So if I now say, okay, I recognize that there's some imprecision in this measurement, and based on some work that I've done in the laboratory, I recognize that the range of sizes that I might get might go anywhere from a low of 4,980 to a high of 5,030. Now when I go to my database, I'm not going to look just for a size that's 5,000. I'll look for something in this range because I know or I've determined in the laboratory that this is the realistic size range that I could expect if I ran something over and over and over again.
How do you determine those ranges?
Well, you could do it you do it just what I said. You take a sample and you run it over and over and over again, and you see how much variation you get when you do that.
All right, go ahead.
And we've done that. And it's boring. Anyway, now when I go to the database, I'm looking at this window of sizes. And now, based on that window of sizes and the numbers that I have in parentheses, I would say I saw 3 people in my database whose sizes were in this range.
Does that have the effect then of ensuring that you don't overstate the rarity of characteristics that are similar or the same?
If your window is appropriately determined, it does.
Why do you adopt that approach in terms of frequency data calculation in your laboratory?
Because that's the logical approach. You can't, if you know the system has a limitation, you have to work around that limitation.
Okay. You also described the existence of a formula for when you're looking at more than one genetic marker.
Yes.
Why is that formula important when you look at more than one marker?
Objection is the foundation of this particular witness.
All right, let me see counsel sidebar with the court report, please.
Questions at the board. You have described the basic method by which frequencies are calculated for a single marker. Is that right?
That's right.
What happens when you encounter more than one marker?
You calculate the frequency for the bands in the first marker, that pair of bands. You calculate the frequency for the pair of bands in the second marker, and to determine the overall frequency for that combination of bands from the first marker and the second marker, you multiply those frequencies together.
Now, you mentioned, and if you would describe the fact that you make an assumption, let me rephrase that. You describe the fact that in using these multiple markers, more than one genetic marker, to calculate a population frequency estimate, and you made a comment about the necessity that they not be related to one another in some fashion. Have I characterized that correctly?
You're close, that the assumption is that they are inherited independently.
What does that mean?
It means that, let me use a very sort of trivial example. Suppose you were looking at a combination of how many people had red hair and green eyes. What it would mean is that the trait for hair color and the trait for eye color didn't affect one another. That is, if you had red hair, you wouldn't automatically have green eyes. Hair color and eye color aren't really a great example of that, but the point works anyway. That is, you cannot and should not multiply these characteristics together if the inheritance of one of them is somehow connected with the inheritance of the other.
Okay, and that's the general concept of using multiple markers in an appropriate fashion?
They need to be independent of one another.
While I have you at the chart, and kind of as a last area, you've given this example of calculating frequencies or how that calculation process is done at one genetic marker. Can you actually give us an example by assigning some frequencies to, for instance, two of the bands as one of the on one of the samples, and then calculate the approximate frequency at that genetic marker?
Yes, if we just use our sample A here,
All right.
and we say that, we'll just draw it down here, and that the frequency for this band was, the band that's 5,000 base pairs was 0.3, and the frequency for the band that's 2,000 base pairs is 0.1. And a factor of 2 gets added to this, or actually multiplied, is what I mean. That falls out of the fact that for any combination of two characteristics, there's 2 ways you can get that combination. And as in this example, you could have inherited the upper band from your mother and the lower band from your father, or you could have inherited the reverse, the upper band from your father and the lower band from your mother. And that results, when you do the math, in requiring that you have a factor of 2 here. So for the frequency for the pair of bands in sample A, it would be 2 times 0.3 times 0.1.
And what would that work out to?
Give me a calculator.
Calculator. If I give you a
0.03 times 2 would be 0.06, I guess.
And would that mean that that's the approximate frequency in your example of having those 2 characteristics in various populations or in a single population in this example?
That's right. Based on our little tiny database here, and assuming I did that in my head correctly, it would be 0.06.
Okay, very good. All right, if you could then, Your Honor, I'm finished with the chart at this point. All right. And if you could retake the witness stand, Dr. Cotton.
Okay.
Now, Dr. Cotton, did your laboratory receive evidence in this case before the court today?
Yes, we did.
As far as receiving that evidence, when it first arrived, well, first of all, did it arrive on the same date or different dates?
All of the evidence did not arrive on the same date.
I'm going to show you, if I may, a series of boards that appear to depict or appear to include photographs of various containers of evidence. Have you had an opportunity to look at some boards that I just described before today?
Yes, I have.
And did you have the opportunity to look closely at those photographs, to compare the items shown in those photographs, as well as the dates found on those boards, and compare those to your own records from the laboratory as to the dates various items of evidence were received at your laboratory?
Yes, I did that.
All right. And referring initially to a large board marked People's Exhibit 177A, and in particular with respect to what appear to be three specific items that are numbered off to the left, item number 7, 12, and an item marked O.J. Simpson blood exemplar. Did you have an opportunity to look at those photographs and the dates that are listed under the column marked 2 cell mark?
Yes, I did.
Did you receive each of those three items on the date after the date noted to the left of the photographs under the column to cell mark for those three item numbers?
Yes, that's right. I went to our records, to the case folder. I looked at the sheets that were used to log in the evidence, which record the date the evidence was received. And for each of those items, the date we received it was after the date that's displayed on the chart.
All right. And that would cover the three items that I just described?
That's right.
All right, I'm going to ask you to look at another chart, which I believe is Exhibit 177. The letter I'll have to wait on. B as in boy. And I think we're able to see it, B as in boy. Let's go right to 177C. On this particular board, Exhibit 177C, in particular with reference to what are listed on the left as item numbers 47, 49, 50, 52, and 56, did you receive those particular items of evidence on the day after the dates listed under the column for each item labeled to cell mark?
That's correct.
All right. Then if we could move to the next board. Which I believe is 177D, as in David. And referring you to 177D, in particular, the items that are labeled Nicole Simpson blood exemplar, Ronald Goldman blood exemplar, and item number 78. Did you receive those items on the day after the specific dates listed under your column or under that column labeled to cell mark?
Yes, we did.
With regard to item number 78, can you tell us exactly what that item contained when it was received in your laboratory?
Yes, but I'll need to refer to the notebook.
And that's the two notebooks you earlier
Yes.
used?
item 78 would have been a single bloodstain swatch.
As far as this term, well, strike that. As far as the items on this board as well as the previous boards, did you at an earlier time look at the actual photographs up close to verify what's labeled on the various containers?
Yes, when I looked at the boards earlier, I checked for the initials of our analyst and the written dates on the envelopes as they're depicted, and I could read them off the photographs, and then I could check them against our records.
That was what I was going to ask. Did you then compare them to your own laboratory records of the various items as they were identified to your laboratory, as well as the days they were received?
Yes, I did.
Lastly, Dr. Cotton, referring you to what I believe is marked People's Exhibit 209, which lists in particular, off to the far right, what appear to be 4 photographs of items that, according to the chart, were directed to your laboratory on April 3rd, 1995. First of all, have you had an opportunity to look at the photographs on this board as well?
I don't actually think that I've looked at these.
Okay. We'll make arrangements for that and we'll return to it then.
Okay.
Now, as far as the evidence that you received, and these various items, with the exception of what's listed on this latest board, 209, were received in your laboratory and you were requested to test those various items?
That's right.
First of all, what was the type of evidence that was contained in most of these envelopes?
Most of them were bloodstained swatches.
Is that a common means of transmitting evidence from one location to another for typing?
Yes, it is.
Is it common that materials or evidence such as that be shipped at room temperature or ambient temperature as you've used that term?
Yes, it is.
Once those items were received in the laboratory, were they identified in the manner that you described earlier, that evidence is identified when it's received in the lab?
Yes.
Now, I'd like to return, if I could, to your description of the earlier visit that included that by Dr. Blake and Dr. Lee.
Okay.
You described the fact that there was evidence actually cut by Dr. Blake. Is that right?
That's right.
I assume that came at a time after the evidence was received in the laboratory by your lab.
That's right.
Do you recall the date that that cutting by Dr. Blake took place on various items?
I don't independently recall the date right now. The notes made by the analyst reflect that the cuttings were made on 7/28/94.
July 28, 1994?
That's right.
Can you tell us exactly which items of evidence, that is by item number? First of all, can you, in referring to the documents in your laboratory, describe for us item numbers as used by the Los Angeles Police Department?
Yes, I can.
With respect to this cutting that occurred on this date that you've just described by Dr. Blake, can you tell us exactly which items were cut by him?
Yes.
Okay, could you do that then,
Okay,
please?
now let me just pull out from the binder the right pages so I don't have to keep moving back and forth.
All right.
The items that were dealt with on that day would have been, you want me to just list them?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. Would have been item number 78, item number 56, item number 52, item number 47, item number 12, and item number 7.
So 6 different items.
Yes.
With regard to these specific items, are you aware that item number 78 was blood-stained material taken from the bottom of Mr. Goldman's boot?
Yes, I am.
With respect to item number 56, are you aware that that's blood staining removed from a shoe print found at the Bundy residence?
Yes, I am.
With regard to item number 52, are you aware that that was a blood stain recovered from the walkway or actually driveway of that same Bundy residence?
Objection, Your Honor. This believe the truth of the matter asserted.
Sustain.
Going back to this cutting process by Dr. Blake, first of all, Dr. Blake is not a member of your laboratory, correct?
That's right.
Is an individual not employed by your laboratory cutting on evidence in your laboratory a part of your protocol?
No, it's not.
Why did that happen?
We were asked specifically,
Nope. Proceed. It was done by court order, correct?
Is that correct, Dr. Cotton?
that's right.
And you followed that court order?
Yes, we did.
As far as a cutting, and first of all, can you tell us approximately how much was cut off by Dr. Blake of these items of evidence?
He cut approximately 10% from each stained swatch.
Now, without going into the actual number of swatches for the other 5 items, that is, other than item number 78, first of all, did the number of swatches for each item vary?
Yes, it did.
Did Dr. Blake cut off 10% of each and every swatch amongst this group of 6 evidence items?
Yes, he did.
And as you, I believe, testified earlier, those 10% portions were maintained in the custody of your laboratory?
That's correct.
This 10% portion, is there anything unique about 10%? In other words, is that a number that was just kind of picked out of thin air, or what?
As part of our routine procedure, we normally set aside 10% of every sample whenever possible for future testing. So we made the prosecution aware that we intended to do that, and some things followed, and following that was the court order that Dr. Blake would take the 10% cutting, so I have assumed that the 10% arose from our initial information that that's what we would normally take.
Okay, when you say you would normally take 10% of a sample, is that in any other case? You'd do that yourselves?
In every case, whenever the size of the sample allows, we will save 10% of the sample for future testing.
Do you have a term that you use to describe that 10% that you save when you're able to?
In the notes, it's just referred as an FTS sample, FTS just standing for future testing sample.
Are there circumstances in which you're unable to keep 10% for future testing purposes?
Yes.
Under what circumstances?
Basically, there's two. One would be that the sample was simply so small that there was no way to physically remove 10% and still have enough left to test. Another thing, for example, if you had a single hair, you can't cut off 10% of the root of the hair. It's just too small to deal with. And the other circumstance would be we might take a 10% cutting, have trouble with the original 90%, and then go back and ask our client permission to use the remaining 10%, and if given permission, then we would go ahead and do that.
As far as the keeping of this future test sample, or 10% cutting, is it kept for any purposes other than simply your ability to go back and use it if necessary?
The future testing sample, this 10%, is just available for whatever future testing might be done. It's not, I'm not saying that it's just for our Cellmark's own future testing, and if we have a problem, the 10% is set aside. Should that 10% that 10% could be given to another laboratory working for either side to be tested later on.
Can that future test sample be tested by the defense in criminal cases?
Of course.
Now, with regard to, and I'm referring now to the samples other than this initial set of 6, where Dr. Blake actually performed the cuttings, did you take future test samples on the remaining items of evidence?
Yes, I believe so.
Did you also receive known samples, that is, known bloodstains from identified persons?
We received 3 known blood stains. The actual identification of whom those blood stains were from was not made known to us at the beginning, and they were just identified as exemplar C1, exemplar C2, and exemplar C3.
So these known or 3 known samples were basically not known to you in terms of who they came from, although you were made aware that they represented reference or standard samples from known people.
That's exactly right.
All right, Mr. Clarke, I need to stop you at this moment. We need to take a 5-minute comfort break at this time, ladies and gentlemen, so let me ask you just to step back into the jury room, and Dr. Cotton, you can step down, stretch your legs, and we'll take a brief recess.
So again, Dr. Cotton, as far as your laboratory was concerned at the time of testing, the identities of the persons from whom those 3 blood samples came from, known samples, were basically unknown to your laboratory.
That's right.
Now, after receiving various pieces of evidence in this case, was testing conducted on them using various DNA typing approaches?
Yes,
And would that be the RFLP as well as PCR approaches?
that's right.
How did you make decisions about which items, whether evidence and known sample or known samples, and which approach was going to be used with those various items? How do you do that?
Well, for some of the items we were requested to do a particular thing. Most of that would be PCR. For some of the items, we were directed to do testing and, if possible, do RFLP testing. So for those items, we would have made an assessment of the quantity and quality of DNA that was extracted from those items, and then we would have proceeded to make some judgment as to whether we should try RFLP or go straight to PCR.
As far as the actual testing conducted in this case, do you have with you today the autorads from RFLP testing that was done?
Yes, I do.
Do you also have photographs from the various typing strips that were interpreted or results were obtained from after PCR amplification?
Yes, I do.
As far as the testing itself, and I'm referring to all of the testing conducted in your laboratory, did the controls work properly?
The controls work properly for all of the testing, with one exception, and we had a very faint dots in one reagent blank for one of the PCR tests.
All right, we'll return to that later. Was that, to your knowledge, the only instance in which that occurred?
Yes.
Incidentally, does the fact that you weren't informed of who these reference samples play any role in the testing itself?
No, it doesn't.
Why didn't you know who they were from?
I'm not sure who made that determination. I've been assuming that it was,
Sustain.
Was it a determination made by you?
no,
Was it a determination made by anyone in your laboratory?
no.
In the course of testing, well, let me rephrase that, go back one step. As far as you're not being informed of the identity of those known samples, is that unusual or normal?
It's unusual, but it's not the only time that we've received samples coded in some manner.
As far as the results that were ultimately obtained, did they include indications to you of mixtures of DNA?
There are 2 samples in the results that are clearly mixtures of DNA.
What is a mixture of DNA? Can you describe that briefly?
Well, in this circumstance, we're talking about the idea that the DNA that was extracted from the sample contains DNA from more than one person.
How are you able to determine that a sample has DNA from more than one person?
For an RFLP test, well, actually, it's the same for both. Anytime that you look at a single genetic location and you see more than 2 types, for an RFLP test, that would be instead of just seeing 2 bands, you saw 3. Or for a PCR test, it would be instead of seeing just 2 types, like an A and a B, you would see an A, a B, and a C. Under those circumstances, you know immediately that you have DNA from more than one person.
As you've used the term earlier, is that contamination as you've used the term?
If you view let me back up a second. If those 2 DNAs are part of the original evidence as it was left at the scene, then in my view, that's not an instance of contamination. That's the true nature of the sample. If you want to back up and say, are these sterile samples? No, we've got two DNAs that are mixed together, but that's not a good reference point for this kind of discussion.
With regard to the procedures, and you've had an opportunity to review all the material relating to this case,
I have.
that includes the autorads themselves?
It does.
Does it include photographs?
Photographs of results?
Yes.
Yes.
Have you had an opportunity to review all of the documents that you described are kept in the course of testing in your laboratory?
Yes, I have.
From that review of the various documents and data, whether photographs or autorads themselves, do you have an opinion about whether or not correct procedures were used by the 2 analysts in this case, Julie Cooper and Paula Yates?
Yes, I do.
What is that opinion?
My opinion is that the procedures in the protocol were followed correctly in the testing in this case.
As far as the procedures that were used in this case, in your opinion, are those proper scientific procedures for DNA typing?
In my opinion, they certainly are.
Now, with regard to, and let's focus immediately on RFLP testing itself, do you have with you an autoradiograph that depicts the 3 standards or known samples in this case?
Yes.
And have you also, well, first of all, do you have the original autoradiographs with you?
Yes, I do.
Do you have a policy in your laboratory about releasing original autoradiographs?
Yes, we do.
What is that policy?
We don't release them until we come to court. If they are left as part of the court record, that's okay, but prior to that, we maintain the original data, which is the autoradiographs, in our custody.
For what reason? Actually, let me rephrase that question. In terms of the originals themselves, do they represent the best data available?
They do.
All right. With regard to the autoradiograph I mentioned that deals or demonstrates the results obtained from DNA from the 3 identified samples, that is without name but identified as known persons, does that autorad, has it already been marked in this case?
They all have the three known people on them.
Okay. Let's go back then to what I believe is Exhibit 246, if I recall correctly. And may I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Showing you Exhibit 246. Can we use that autoradiograph to show what the DNA appears, or what it appears like for the three known samples in this case?
Yes.
So may I just take one look at what she's looking at? Thank you.
That's 246.
Your Honor, at this time I have, or actually the laboratory has made a number of copies of this particular autoradiograph that shows the three standards, that is the three known individuals. It has one evidence lane with nothing showing. And it would be my request that these copies be distributed to the jury. Yes,
Have you shown these to counsel?
they have one copy.
All right, Mr. Clarke, may I see one of those, please? Yes. I take it these are all duplicates of the same?
Yes.
If you want to hand it to Mrs. Robertson, I just need to see one. All right, and Mr. Clarke, these are exact duplicates of 246?
Yes.
And that's with item 56 removed, correct?
I'm sorry?
That's with item 56 removed. Never mind. All right, Mr. Clarke, do you have enough to go around?
Yes.
Mr. Neufeld?
I just hadn't seen the copies, Your Honor. I just wanted to,
Okay.
sometimes there's some variation, that's all. I want to
Mr.
make sure
Clarke, why don't you let
they're
Mr. Neufeld
consistent,
see a
that's
copy
all.
there?
May I? I'm going to compare it.
Demonstration purposes at this point, because we're not doing any comparison yet, correct?
Only amongst the three knowns.
All right, with court reporter, please. Clarke, you may proceed.
One auto rad, Your Honor. That's an acceptable place for it. I have 17 in my hand, and I actually have one, if the court would keep that.
Well, thank you.
I will have one. Dr. Cotton, showing you a series of x-rays that have not been marked as yet. Actually, would the court prefer they be marked or not? I'm going to ask that they be distributed to the jury.
Let's call these, actually give them a separate number since they're going to be exhibited to the jury. They should be part of the record.
All right. Would that be 256 then?
256. Collectively, 17 copied auto rads.
Dr. Cotton, have you had an opportunity to look at the 17 copies of the auto rad that will be marked People's 256?
Yes, I looked at them when I was still at the lab before I gave them to you.
And are they in fact copies, as is Exhibit 246, of one of the auto rads in this case?
They are.
With respect to those auto rads as contained in both 246 and now in 256, does that auto rad represent data from this case?
Yes, it does.
And what does it depict, just in general terms, as far as samples?
The samples that are on here, besides the control samples, are the known blood from Mr. Simpson, the known blood from Nicole Brown, and the known blood from Ronald Goldman. And also on this film, had there been anything to see, would have been analyzed item number 56.
Is that the shoe print?
Yes, there is, however, no DNA banding pattern that was obtained from item 56.
So can we use this auto rad as a demonstration of the RFLP process and differences, if any, between the three known persons in this case?
Yes, we can.
As far as this auto rad itself, is it labeled with names for each of these three individuals, Mr. Simpson, Nicole Brown, and Ronald Goldman?
Yes, it is.
Were those labels put on at some later date after the auto rad was initially produced?
Yes, they were.
In other words, during the testing, you didn't know who the individuals were, correct?
That's right.
That is, the identities of these known samples.
That's right.
Were the labels then put on after your results were reported?
Yes, they were.
All right. Your Honor, I was going to ask that those be distributed to the jury and then utilize the original on the Elmo so that the witness can describe what's shown on this autoradiograph.
Well, given the hour, I would suggest that we distribute them since we've held it up and shown them. Let's let the jury see what an auto rad looks like, then we'll start with that tomorrow morning.
Very good.
All right, let's let the jury see what an auto rad looks like.
May I hand it to the jury?
You may.
Wait.
you'll just pass those down then to your right. And Mr. Clarke, would you collect those from the bailiff, please? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take our recess for the afternoon. Please remember all my admonitions to you. Do not discuss this case amongst yourselves. Do not form any opinions about the case. Don't conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Don't allow anybody to communicate with you with regard to the case, and we'll see you here tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. And Dr. Cotton tomorrow morning, 8:45, and I'll see council in 10 minutes. All right, we'll stand in recess.